Welcome back to episode number 8 on the wealth of self. Our guest today on the podcast is Darin Somma. Darin is a yoga practitioner who has been teaching meditation and yoga for over 2 decades in the nation's capital. He's a certified yoga therapist and an advisor on the board of Universities Institute of Yoga Therapy and Meditation. Growing up in Virginia Beach, Darin found himself just miles away from the Christian Broadcast Network headquarters and Regent Universities, one of the largest military bases in Norfolk, and just a few miles away from the first landing, which was actually the first settling grounds for Europeans when entering the mainland of the United States. This unique intersection created a highly transient environment during many of Darin's most formative years. At the feeble age of 4, Darin distinctly remembers an intense sensation of boredom and began to ask himself why he was here. His mother helped guide him through this uncertainty and let him know that he simply needed to make the world a better place. That simple sentence became his life's mission. Darin has a background in science, holding degrees in math, physics, philosophy, and psychology. And while he loved the analytical tools of the sciences, he found that the common worldview of scientists and assumptions of the physical world were severely lacking. This pushed him to further his pursuit of the teachings of yoga and the vast sciences of the consciousness. Darin's story is incredibly diverse and certainly more detailed than we can fully encapsulate in this simple conversation. But his teachings of compassion, love, and spiritual connection are ones that I hope everyone listening can resonate with and use to improve their own life by finding a deeper wealth of self. Let's kick this episode off with Darin Somma. All right, welcome back to The Wealth of Self. I am beyond excited to have Darin here in the studio again. This is not the first time we've spoken, but this is, I think, the first time we'll be able to really take a deep dive on his life, and I'm very excited to have you all along for that ride. And I'm going to kick it over here for our intro to Darin. So thanks for making the time to come in and speak to me. I've wanted to do this for The Wealth of Self for a long time, and in many ways I felt like our first conversation just started to kind of scratch the surface. And, I don't think you can fully tell this story. I think you kind of have to experience it in order to really understand it to its full magnitude. But I'm really very excited to dive in a little bit further with you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a great opportunity, and I really appreciate the platform and what the podcast represents.
Of course. Thank you. And your expression of enjoying the title, The Wealth of Self, that makes me feel really great. I looked back at some paperwork and whatnot for when I first sort of started to conceptualize this idea. And it was back in 2018, I think, when I made the web domain purchase initially and started to write down some of the concepts for Wealth of Self. So it's only recently really started to develop, and over the course of my about 2.5 years in DC, I've met some really wonderful people, and the mission to tell their story and to at least share their voice has been on my heart heavily. And a part of that also was losing mom. Her story was so important to me, and her memory was so vibrant, and not being able to do that justice in many ways has been a fire under my butt, a catalyst, if you will, to make sure that I do my due diligence to have these stories told and do it in a way that's accessible for as many people as possible.
Yeah.
So,
well, I was sold as soon as you told me the title of the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, because the wealth of self is the greatest wealth. And that's really beautiful what you just shared about the inspiration behind it. Very resonant with my own inspirations. So.
Well, thank you for that. Well, I think based on our conversations and everything that we've discussed up to this point, truly understanding your story can be a challenge. I think it is for everyone because the intricacies of our lives are so deep that to share that with someone and expect them to get it on the first go is a bit of an impossible task. It's a very tall order. But I found that in the conversations I have been able to have with people that giving a little bit of an origin, a backstory, and understanding how you got to where you are and how those pivotal moments throughout your upbringing and throughout your life have informed what you do now and your message moving forward makes it at least a little bit more digestible for people. So I wanted to go back, and you provided some beautiful responses in our initial our conversation, and I'd love to hear more about your origin and how some of those early moments informed and helped you grow as a young man.
Well, thank you. I when I was 4 years old, I had this first sort of experience of boredom. You could call it like an existential crisis, you know?
Yeah, at 4 years old.
4 years old. But it was a really visceral experience in my nervous system. I remember walking around the house and I was like, what am I doing here? What am I supposed to be doing? And I remember feeling a little down and not knowing what to do with myself. So I just sat down beside my mother. She was watching the news, and which was, of course, upsetting. And she suddenly turned to me and said, Darin, the world is a very messed up place. You need to do something to make it better. And, my mother was my world, of course, as a child. And so I really took that to heart as a life mission. And, growing up in Virginia Beach is, I think, in general in Western society, suburban society, it's a very unnatural sort of way to grow up. On some hands, it was really cool because, my best friends growing up were like Egyptian, Filipino, Japanese. And
yeah. So you had a lot of diversity in your friend group at an early age.
Yeah, very much. And so I was exposed to a lot of different cultures too. But it was a very strong military presence there. The largest military base in the world was in Norfolk, right next door. And so we always had a lot of military families and a lot of transients. And
a lot of movement with military folks.
Yeah.
Continual.
Yeah, exactly. So. No, and there was also this sort of military attitude too, I think. People were really tough. And there was a lot of fear also. It wasn't like an inner city, neighborhood or anything. But it wasn't the safest feeling, of course. And public school was quite a challenge for me, And, I hesitate to say that because it really wasn't like, I have a lot of privilege, but my family was lower middle class, even though, both my parents had doctorate degrees.
Yeah, right.
But the fear was always there because regardless of how people appeared, there was always trauma underneath. And I think one of the motivating factors in my life was this sharing of love with people, these heart connections. And I think my mother has this beautiful, amazing quality that she always feels like everybody is worthy of love, like unconditional, even the worst people. It's like,
it's a beautiful quality to have.
It is. Yeah. It's not to ignore the negative things, it's to recognize them, but to still, hold them in your heart, not to, think that they're worthless or unworthy of, support.
Right.
And that made me sort of a natural confidant, I think, for a lot of people. Especially women. I had a lot of female friends growing up. They found it very easy to talk to me. And what was really sort of upsetting, I think, as I was growing up was hearing how many of those female friends had been sexually abused.
It's staggering.
It's staggering.
When you actually, if you're close to someone and they open up about that, the connections to other individuals, other women who have experienced stuff like that, it's very sad. Yeah.
I think it's a silent epidemic that we're not in full recognition of. So, Yeah, and especially when I got to college, when I had to ask myself, what is it I want to do with my life, right? And at that point, nothing had really interested me. I was really deep into philosophy because I was searching for truth. It was my answer to how I can make the world a better place, you know? It was actually interesting because I have this sort of like conquistador gusto, you know, when I was like, okay, I need to make the world a better place, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to become the richest person in the world, right? That was my first thought as a little kid.
How to make the most influence.
Right.
Have all the money.
And then my grandmother set up a college fund for me, and I saw I was getting all this money, and I was like, oh, wow, you know, this is, you know, but then I kind of somehow, you know, went from there. I was like, oh, well, money's not going to be enough. I need political power, right? So I wanted to be a politician. And then my grandfather was like, oh, no, they're all crooks and liars, you know.
He's not too far off.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, you know, he actually had experience in politics too, so he knew the inside reality of it. But when I studied these political arguments, you know, growing up, it always struck me as funny that there was an argument, because it's like, well, if the truth is known, what is there to debate?
What is there to argue
about? What is there to argue about, right?
Right.
Very innocent, but you know, poignant sentiment there. And so I made this my life mission to discover truth. And when I encountered physics in high school, I got so engaged, because here was something, after years of philosophizing, you know, and not really knowing what ground you're standing on, here was something that was like black and white,
right?
You know, either you got the answer or you didn't. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to be a theoretical physicist, right?
And that's the allure for a lot of people who enter the field of mathematics, is because it's definite, or at least that's the perception of it, is that these are hard and fast rules. You can really sink your teeth into it and get a firm answer.
Exactly.
A lot of people love the tangible nature of that, I think.
Yeah. No, and I like how you cued in on mathematics too, because there's that saying at college that, or university, every biologist considers him or herself a chemist, right? Because all biology is based on chemistry. Every chemist considers themselves physicists, because chemistry is based on physics.
Right.
Every physicist considers themselves a mathematician, because all physics is based on math.
Yeah.
And every mathematician considers themselves a god.
And so it goes. Yeah. Wow. Okay. I've never heard that chain connected like that, but now I have.
But yeah, when I was studying physics, I was really engaged, and but then I started running up against this wall that I was very sensitive to, because of all the philosophy that I had studied also. That here was something that, especially when you got to like subatomic, you know, physics, where you're like questioning the very building blocks of matter, you know, what is the stuff that the universe is made out of ultimately. I realized that, you know, no matter what experiments were done, that the physicists were never considering the possibility that the observer and the observed are made of the same stuff, right? Which is consciousness. I really loved the concept of idealism when I studied it, and it explains, you know, a lot of things that a more realist material outlook can't appreciate, which is you know, like occult phenomenon, mysticism, a lot of these things that we call hocus pocus, right?
Right.
But you know, sometimes these things are so like overwhelmingly, you know, evident that it's amazing. You know, we still deny it.
That it's overlooked or denied. Yeah.
Right. But so I became a little disillusioned with physics, but then I had this experience of coming home to myself, and that was when I discovered that the great wealth of self, right?
Yeah.
That everything I needed was inside of me,
Right.
and everything is alive. You know, it was the trees were there talking to me, and I was talking to them, apologizing for being away for so long on this long trip, and it was a beautiful moment of coming home to the reality of spirit, and it was not a theory. And this is why, you know, scientists are so resistant to it, because you can't conceive of it until you experience it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I wanted to go back just a little bit, because one of the things that we discussed before starting our recording was that there was this sort of unspoken pressure that was placed on you as a young man that you could do anything you wanted, right? And I think that's as we talked about, living in a society of abundance here in America, it's almost like a choice of paradox. Because realistically, if you had the fortitude and the will to do so, you could teach yourself and form yourself into conceivably whatever it is that you want it to be from a career perspective.
Right.
So you say that out loud, and you say, I've this sort of burden of choice is placed on you. How did you navigate that in that early phase? Because I think that kind of goes hand in hand with that boredom and some of that uncertainty that accompanies understanding that next phase of what do you choose to do? How do you choose to form yourself?
Yeah, no, it's really profound complex that I think a lot of people growing up in the West face, particularly white males. We have all this privilege, and we have this sort of feeling that society is expecting us to do great things, that we have to be great. This is why white men love to talk at the meetings, right?
This is having a podcast. I hope that doesn't fall too much into the same category.
Yeah, no, we're not talking over anybody, right? So,
trying not at all. Sharing the platform if we can.
Yeah, exactly. And but there is this burden of expectation and how to feel good about yourself. What it is you're doing in the world, and that was interestingly enough at odds with my spiritual mission to find myself. Because who I really am isn't dependent on any external factor, right? This is the beauty of what yoga promises to give to us, is an indestructible wealth that nothing can touch, but we definitely, all of us feel social pressures. We were molded by them, influenced by them. And I mean, really, it wasn't until recently that I started feeling good about what it is I'm doing,
It's a long journey, or it has been.
It has been a long journey, exactly, yeah. Because when I left college, I didn't want to go get a job. I was very much called to pursue the spiritual truth that I had touched on. And I lived at a Buddhist monastery for half a year and thought about becoming a monk. And then...
Where was that? Can you go into detail on the specifics of that experience for you?
Yeah, I was incredibly blessed to meet Venerable Master Thich Nhat Hanh. I did a 3-week retreat on mindfulness with him in Vermont and discovered this amazing community of monastics who their practice is living deeply in the present moment.
Yeah.
And that was what I had touched, is like, it's all right here, right now. And here they were not only knowing that truth, but cultivating it. And interesting enough, the Dharma name that they gave me when I took their trainings was Joyful Cultivation of the Heart.
Very nice.
It was very accurate. They pinned it, because that's what I really loved about it, was this cultivation of the heart. Living at the monastery, I felt the burden of wanting to use my potential, still. I didn't feel comfortable cloistering myself away in a monastery where, I'd be very secluded. And actually, that's what it means to become a monk, is that you're renouncing the world. I wasn't ready to renounce the world. I wanted to do something in it.
When you reflect on that, was there a sensation of selfishness in that moment because you still felt that you had more to give or wanted to go out and be more in the world? And then reflecting on how, in that environment, renouncing the world in many ways is giving up that self in certain ways. Was there any emotional debate that you fought through in that moment?
It's a beautiful question, because I was so happy at the monastery. It was daily. You meditate that much, and everything is a meditation. Even every step you take is a meditation. Following your breath, it's this incredible joy, mental joy that just fills every moment of your day.
Right.
So I knew that because of that, that it wasn't selfish in that way, because my restlessness was because of all the people that I loved. All these friends that I had made in college. I love them so deeply. I didn't want to abandon them. And so what I tried to do was live as a monk outside of the monastery. And that probably turned out to be too much of a selfish decision, a selfish answer, because I had experience in understanding that you could live on faith like this. But I didn't know this is actually an age-old tradition. Cultures world around, they support renunciates, spiritual renunciates, especially in India. There's an estimated 40 million sadhus. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that's a staggering number then.
Staggering number. Yeah, it's part of their culture is to support the sadhu, is what it's called, the spiritual renunciate who's renounced the world, but they really want to get that spiritual wealth, and then they can share those blessings with all of society. So it's society's obligation to support them.
Right.
If I had been a renunciate in India, it would have been very easy.
Yeah.
But I was a renunciate. I started off in Europe and then America, and most of the time, like the projection was, go get a job. Right.
Right. It's the bum mentality, right? Like you're not contributing in the traditional sense. You're not contributing at all.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So I was really blessed to be guided spiritually. I found an ashram only 3 hours from where I grew up in Virginia Beach called Yogaville. And I heard about it when I was in Europe, of all places. But there was a great master there, Swami Satchidananda. And boy, he was... I could talk for hours about the greatness of Swami Satchidananda, just like I could talk for hours about Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. So I really count my blessings there. But I got this very authentic education in yoga lifestyle, because that's what an ashram means. It means a refuge place where you're cultivating inwardness and spirituality.
And that doesn't have to represent a physical space necessarily. That can be wherever you are able to cultivate that message for yourself, right?
Yeah, and it's actually beautiful in Sanskrit. There's ashram means refuge, so it means like a physical place where the guru is and the spiritual practitioners are. But it could also refer to the 4 stages of life, which is, when you're a celibate, a young person studying, learning, and you become a householder, then you become forest dweller, then you become a renunciate. This is like the life plan. But they're called, all those 4 stages are called ashrams. And a dear friend of mine, Dr. Chintamani Yogiji, he's an incredible humanitarian, but he was the one who told me when I got married that married life is an ashram, And so that's been my attitude in cultivating my home. The place of sacred refuge.
Well, you're navigating now at this early phase through Europe and then into America, and at a certain point you're making your round back into Washington, D.C., into this range. What does that geographic sort of transition look like for you in more detail?
Well, I always loved D.C. when I visited it. There was something about the energy here that I felt electric, because it's not like New York, which is so much about sort of like money and fame and things like that. DC is very much about power, but it's also, because there's so much power here, there's a lot of people that are passionate about change. And so I naturally found just incredible communities of people here. When I moved into DC as a very poor yogi, I couldn't afford much. So I found this group home to move into, and it was happened to be an activist group home.
Yeah.
And particularly, the house was really central in a lot of ways to independent media in the area. And that was just phenomenal to be around. These people are very passionate about independent media, getting your news from different sources, and and looking at the world through that lens. Right. It gives you a very different picture.
Oh, it does. I remember, I don't know how much this aligns, but Democracy Now! TV, yes. This was something my mom was an avid viewer of, and it was just it was a much calmer, less bad news bias, and it really focused on global issues, and it didn't have the spin that a lot of the other major networks had.
That's right.
And it was just, I didn't watch news much with her, and I don't now, but when I reflect on those moments, it was refreshing to have that voice. Amy Goodman, I think was her name.
Exactly.
So
I had the pleasure of meeting Amy Goodman one time at one of her speaking events.
Really?
And she just has this incredible presence that I really respect and honor, because I could see how much she's holding. It takes immense strength and courage to tell the stories of so many suffering people. Living in DC was really interesting in that way, because here I was with this spiritual wealth, and a lot of the activists were very how can I say, atheist.
Yeah, and I sense that is a strong presence in DC and in many major cities, I would say.
Yeah. No, I think there's some refuge that sort of a scientific outlook gives a lot of people, because so many of us are children of religious abuse, and this is one of the hardest things that I saw, especially teaching yoga in DC, is how many people are very quick to throw the baby out with the bathwater, essentially, with that, and really rejecting spirituality in that way, because they're intimidated by it, scared by it, they're traumatized by it.
Right. And I think if you look at the media, you look at films like, I think it was Spotlight, where it sort of reveals the atrocities within the Catholic Church and pedophilia and these kind of things. It's like that's what people see a lot of times when they think of the traditional church structure, and it further separates people who I believe, even like myself, who would long for a deeper spiritual connection and feel so at odds with how to even begin pursuit of a mission like that. So I understand that message, and I think it's difficult for people to reach into themselves and pull out that message whenever that's what they see on the TV,
right?
Essentially. And
that's exactly it. In talking with people who consider themselves atheists, it would always, the justifications I uniformly heard, and maybe I haven't talked to every atheist on the planet, obviously, but every single one I talked to, they all base their belief on the rejection of other people's beliefs. Right? And when you start pressing and saying, so what is it you believe? Most of them would defer to agnosticism. Like, okay, well, the truth is I don't really know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I saw a bumper sticker. It was like, I'm a military agnostic, right?
Interesting.
I don't know, and you don't know either.
They're telling you what you don't know. Yeah. So where were you in Europe? I think that's an element that I never was familiar with.
So when I left the monastery, I walked to Toulouse, middle of the winter. I remember calling the monastery, and one of the monks answered, "It's like, oh, Darin, we thought you died."
Oh my gosh!
And you learn how to get by in situations like that. I remember, like, my fingers were so numb I couldn't unbutton my jeans to go to the bathroom at one point. And and then I can't say I suffered because I did it to myself, But so I traveled through France, and it was mostly visiting community that I met at the monastery. I went through Belgium, Holland, many places in Germany, Austria. And I met Patch Adams actually in Germany. I did a 2-day workshop with him. It was on glücklich zu sein. It's like how to be happy, being happy.
Being happy.
Right. It was beautiful. It was so funny just dressing up with German friends and as clowns and going around just trying to make people laugh in whatever way you can. Definitely about bringing joy and cultivating that. And then I went through Austria to Italy, and I even went down to Egypt because some of my friends that I grew up with happened to be going to Cairo, and so I went to visited them, and and then I came back, and I went to Slovenia also, and then eventually came back home. Europe's such a unique place also because they have so much history. They don't have the same sense of freedom I think that we have, because even if they're modern in their outlook, there's buildings that are hundreds of years old all over
surrounding
you.
At all points in time.
So the voice of the ancestors, the religious ancestors, is still very strong there. They don't have the sort of freedom to reject it.
Right. And I think you look at more modern developments in the United States, or even newer cities. If you go out west and you're in Park City, Utah, or Denver, Colorado, or these sorts of places, generally speaking, it's a pretty new spot. And now more and more you're seeing these sort of mid-sized American cities blossoming. Maybe they're gaining a university system, and it's having an influx of people come in, and it's like there's really nothing old there. Outside of the dirt beneath your feet,
Right.
there aren't many buildings or other structures that hold that history close to you
Mm-hmm.
and present it in that way. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about some figures in your life that have served as mentors or guiding lights. There are a number of these people directly in the world of yoga, but also this gentleman, Ed Carlson, aka the Waver, and this is someone who had a big influence on your outlook. And I was hoping you could share some more about him.
Sure. Yeah. So when I got my junior year of college, that was when the emptiness of what I was studying was really hitting me, and I got this wild idea. I told my mom about it. I was like, and for the summer, I just want to go walking. And she said, well, walking where? And I was like, everywhere, I didn't I just knew I wanted to go walking. And she heard this man speak at her church. He went to Unity Church. His name was Ed Carlson, also known as the Waver, because that's what he had chosen to do with his life. At some point, he just renounced the world and started walking around the country and waving to people on the roadside to send his love. And somebody had interviewed him to write his story, and my mom sent me his book, and it was phenomenal. The way that Spirit had guided him, it was the hand of Spirit was undeniable, in those choices, even sometimes like yelling at him what he needed to do,
Yeah.
And I was so inspired by that. I realized that this is a principle, some people might call it the law of attraction, but the really basic idea that if you place your faith in the universe will take care of you. It is a universal concept, especially in indigenous cultures, And so I wanted to experience that for myself. So I went walking that summer, had an incredible adventure. And
Where did your journey take you? And how long were you on your adventure?
I was on for the duration of the summer. So it was about 3 months, and basically up the East Coast. I first started at my university and walked down the Appalachian Trail.
Very nice.
For a week. And and I've experienced the same thing of just miraculous coincidences providing exactly what I needed. And, I didn't know anything when I first set out. I had this pack that weighed like 80 pounds with canned food in it.
Canned food.
And then when the walk was completed, Ed Carlson came back to Virginia Beach. And so I got the opportunity to meet him. And I can't describe the energy coming off of him. It was electric, and he just radiated this incredible light and love. And he was so like laid back, what we did when we hung out together was, watch the football game. And he asked me if I wanted a beer. I was like, no, I'm okay. Thank you. It was very American, spiritual master in that way, but he was definitely a spiritual master. Without a doubt. I remember, when I said goodbye to him, he gave me this hug, and on the ride home, I was bursting into tears and crying because the hug touched me so deeply in my heart. Yeah, it was so beautiful. So that was really like the first holy person that I had the pleasure of meeting in person like that.
And that was before you really embarked on this deeper adventure and meeting many figureheads within the yoga community.
That's right.
Yeah. So you're at this point now, and sort of bouncing forward now to your time in Washington, D.C., you're, I think, beginning to identify that to make a living in this space, the West in a lot of ways has commercialized yoga, and to its detriment in some ways, because even during our conversation prior to the recording, you talked about how a colleague of yours was hoping to introduce yoga onto their website as an offering or a service of some sort, and you heard another individual say, why would you put that on there? I believe it was maybe his wife,
yeah.
Right? So when you reflect on an instance like that, how do you think about processing someone feeling as though yoga is toxic or in some ways not what you view it as?
It's a central mission of mine is to help reclaim the sacred, and yoga is the perfect vehicle for it. Because what yoga really is the science of spirituality, and this is why I was drawn to it. It made it filled the holes that physics couldn't for me. What's beautiful about yoga, the religion that it comes from is called Sanatana Dharma. We often call that Hinduism. But the unique thing about Sanatana Dharma is that no matter what question you have, there's an answer for it. Something that growing up in like Judeo-Christian backgrounds, it's like, you don't question that, don't question this, So I loved the scientific nature of it. It took me a long time to appreciate some of it because it's so developed. You're looking, it's prehistoric how rich it is. And it can be overwhelming for anybody who goes to India the first time, how many sights and sounds and smells assault your senses as soon as you get there. And that's their culture because it celebrates the diversity of the divinity. It was interesting as a yoga teacher. When I started off, it was very young. It was back in 2000. It was starting to get really popular. So everybody wanted yoga teachers. So it was really, and I was getting invitations to teach at every studio, especially as a man. There weren't many male teachers back then. And I had these experiences in an ashram and with my first yoga teacher, it was very authentic. So I had a good grasp of the tradition that was very valued. But back then, there was still this sense that if what you were practicing didn't come from a lineage, that maybe it shouldn't be called yoga. There's still people making up stuff and giving it a Sanskrit name. But what was happening at that time was Yoga Alliance was formed with this noble intention to try and get credentials for yoga teachers so that maybe one day they could enjoy the same benefits that like acupuncturists enjoy, which is they're covered by insurance, right? And I remember being at a yoga conference, and there's Yoga Alliance that made this presentation, and there were some really senior teachers there that were against the idea. And I was like, why would you be against this? This is such a simple thing. It's band together. But what they understood properly is that yoga is an esoteric science. It means it's hidden. And if you're drawn to it, then you learn, right? But a master will always recognize another master. It doesn't matter if they're from a different lineage. It doesn't matter if they're practicing differently. They see each other. And so why do you need, a official organization
accreditation
to accredit
whatever.
you? Right. It's already accredited by thousands of years. Right? And so, and this funny thing happened because Yoga Alliance started having registered yoga schools where you could get a registered yoga school and teach people how to be yoga teachers. Now, all these people started asking me if I was going to start my yoga school. And I was like, I've only been teaching a couple of years. I've never taken a yoga teacher training myself. I'm just I'm just sharing
Early
what
phases,
I learned. It seemed crazy to me, but everybody was doing it because if a studio wanted to survive, thrive even, not just barely survive, these yoga teacher trainings were a great way of doing it. And so I did that. I did form my own yoga school, and I called it Sri Yoga because it just means yoga is sacred. I wasn't trying to create a new line or anything. I was just saying, and I told all my students, I'm not your guru, I'm not representing a line here. I'm just sharing what I learned from these different sources that I know are authentic sources. And then yoga started changing, especially when I came back from my pilgrimage in India. The board of Yoga Alliance had changed from all these incredible spiritual practitioners to all business people. And I was like, wait, this is going in the wrong direction, you know? And then slowly I was kind of pushed out of the studio scene because what I taught didn't have that sort of market appeal, and, questions of self-worth were very present there. That was challenging. But I dealt with it by finding other jobs and other work, but I always felt something special when I would teach yoga, something very powerful going on there. And then I was really blessed. My guru, Her Holiness Amma Shri Karunamai, blessed me to teach this very special yoga sequence. And then I suddenly had a line that I could share, in an authentic way. And that led itself very naturally into yoga therapy. And now there's this enormous interest in yoga therapy because people are realizing that there is this incredible potential here, But there's also a lot of confusion because what people, as you said, are associating with yoga now is very inaccessible for a lot of people. People think, I can't do yoga. I could have never take those high-powered fitness classes, But the irony is that traditionally, people didn't do yoga in India. It was only if you were really sick that you would go and learn yoga, right? To try and
Sort of a healing methodology then.
exactly. And that was actually the original practice of yoga, what's called yoga asana. Asana means poses, postures. You do these different postures and they rid the body of disease. And the purpose of ridding the body of disease is so that you can sit in meditation and realize the Supreme Self. So there was always, this higher goal and this higher reason for existing, with yoga. And this is, where I struggle to find the right words for the message, because I know how hard it is for somebody who's been traumatized by spirituality, who's been traumatized by religion. And there's a lot of the flip side of, rejection of spirituality is the egoic embracing of it, and, the narcissism that comes from thinking I'm this spiritual person, and doing spiritual bypassing all the time and just being really insensitive ultimately. Right. But the authentic message of spirituality is to reconnect ourselves with the sacred. And what the sacred is beyond description. Nobody can own it. If you can describe it, it could be owned.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's the most difficult part about having the conversation like this is where, in order to properly relay the details that someone might need in order to inspire them to take that journey, like you said, you kind of have to be drawn to it.
Yeah.
It's not something that you can pull someone toward. They have to do it on their own in many ways.
That's exactly right. And I love this comparison that, in India, there's a lot of physical poverty. That's their main problem, right? Yes. Just basics of life, food, clean water, shelter, education. In the West, we have all those things, for most everybody,
Right.
But we have this enormous spiritual poverty. And this great estrangement from ourselves. Either you're intensely religious and suffering in that world without maybe recognizing it, or you're incredibly rejectionary of it and suffering in that world.
Yeah.
And and you're right. It has to come from within. But I think there are so many people who are yearning for that sense of connection. Because as I mentioned, growing up in Virginia Beach, it's a suburban wasteland. You got shopping, malls all over the place, and it's just sprawl, dead sprawl. And so we were suffering so much from disconnection in every way imaginable. Yeah. But what yoga can really give us is that reconnection with the sacred and the ability to reclaim words like God. This is something so beautiful. I have to share this. In Sanatana Dharma, God is not this monolithic entity, right? Now, actually, this is a big misconception. People think Hinduism is polytheistic. It's actually a monotheistic religion. And it's the most ancient monotheistic religion. God is only one, and that one supreme self is none other than your own self, which is the greatest wealth.
Profound, very profound.
But in order to have a relationship with the divinity as the super self, either you realize it through intense discriminatory effort, which takes a very advanced soul and a very strong intellect and a lot of blessing power. It takes intense devotion to go straight to the absolute truth like that. Right. Most people need a form of God to talk to pray to love and adore, to have a relationship with, to see manifesting and talking through the universe. And that's called Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion. And what's beautiful about Sanatana Dharma is that every God is the only God. Right? So it was really confusing, at first you hear like Ganesha is the supreme consciousness, the absolute, omnipotent, omnipresent. And you're like, well, okay, what about his parents, Oh, Shiva is the absolute, the omnipresent, the omnipotent. But it's such a profound understanding that's an incredible wealth that India has.
Yes.
The appreciation of diversity. And what really struck me when I was in India is the presence of mind that people have when they talk to you. They really listen. They're really open-minded. Even people who start off closed-minded can have a really open-minded, heart-centered conversation.
Right.
And here we're very reactionary. We want to
very much so
end conversations and not get too deep.
And very distracted too. And I think that that's something that we discussed previously, where you talked about DC, bringing it back to DC a little bit, is a place where it sort of pulls people who want to affect change. They see this as a political power grid in some ways. And for those who are brave enough to come here and try and affect that change, they can wear themselves out or burn themselves down almost entirely. And that's something that you talked about as you were sort of building your business and trying to spread this message, that you encountered people regularly who were in that boat, who had come here to affect change and positive change at that, but had found themselves in a position where they were essentially depleted entirely of themselves, their spirituality, of their efforts. What did that look like for you when you started to encounter those stories over and over again, and how did it inform your next sort of moves?
Yeah, well, there's an incredible diversity of people here looking for change. And I remember one of my housemates grew up in Lebanon, the civil war there, and so carried a lot of trauma surrounding that, but a very passionate about independent media as a result, and getting these stories out.
Right.
You know, for that person, it wasn't a question of just information. It was a matter of life or death. And you saw how that stress had a toll, you know, because there wasn't any sort of refuge to go to trust that everything's going to be okay. And that's really the beauty that the sacred can offer us, is an inner ashram, an inner refuge, where we can, you know, regardless of what it looks like on the outside, we can find a center that's calm and peaceful and restorative. But I definitely saw that in the activist community, and it was sad because it would lead to inner fighting in the activist groups and a lot of self-sabotage, and you see this enormous potential just like dissipate because there wasn't anything common that could unite them and bond them together.
Well, do you feel like your teachings and your abilities to share that message is something that could have served as a foundational platform to hold those groups together? And is there some sense of, I don't know if there's any guilt associated with that, not being able to bring that to the forefront more fully, but I know that is the continuing mission, being here and working in this region.
Yeah, I had certainly hoped that, you know, something bigger would have happened. But I do trust what's happening, you know, because I've been blessed to find that inner refuge. And there are moments of great discouragement that, you know, you just roll with the punches. You're like, okay, well, I can't teach yoga to make a living. Let me, you know, be a math teacher. Let me be a carpenter. Let me do these other things. And still, you know, teach to whoever's willing to share the journey. And it's beautiful because I know I'm not alone in that. You know, the very few people who are drawn to regularly take my, I don't like to call them classes now because they're more like collective prayer sessions. It's so profound what we're sharing together. You know, we really have this sense of connection and deeper trust.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say thanks again for your viewership on the Wealth of Self. If you're enjoying this content, please give this video a like, and don't forget to comment down below if parts of this conversation are really resonating with you or maybe even somebody you know. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and you'll be among the first people notified whenever new content is released. Additionally, if you'd like to support the Wealth of Self's mission, there is a Patreon link down in the description where you can become a monthly supporter. Behind the stories, there are a lot of cameras and lights and audio equipment and everything that helps these videos come to life. It takes a lot to run all of that consistently, and your support makes sure that we can regularly release these stories. Finally, if you are a photographer or maybe you're interested in video production and you'd like to learn more about the equipment that we are using to document these stories, you can check out the kit.co link also in the description. Any purchases that you make there will earn a small commission for us to keep on telling these stories. So without further ado, let's get back to the interview. Well, one of the common themes that you've reiterated a number of times, but we haven't gone in very deep on, is the Divine Mother. You talk about how that entity has been a guiding force throughout your entire journey. And I was hoping you could share more about that and go into more detail for those individuals who may be listening or watching who don't know what that is, essentially.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, so we just talked about how the divine can come in any form. Everybody, feels love on some level for their mother, even if they had a terrible mother,
Right.
But this is something very profound, is that the Divine Mother, like the Divine Father, is everybody's mother, everybody's father. And the path of Divine Mother is really one of sweetness and love. Mother doesn't teach you with a whip, right? Yeah. She does have a goad of anger, right? But it's actually like a really big blessing if you receive that, because that means you're very close to her, because she's a short weapon, What's long that she has is her noose of love. And that noose, once you're touched by the love of the Divine Mother, your life is never going to be the same. What struck me was I was at the monastery in France, and one of my friends who had just become a monk, his twin brother came to visit, and with him he had brought this picture of an Indian saint. Her name's Mother Meera. I was getting to know him, and I looked and I saw her eyes. I stopped our conversation and I just asked, I was like, "Who is that?" Because there was an energy, there was a power that I felt, and that I recognized in that moment of homecoming. It was very familiar. And he explained that Mother Meera is a saint. She gives what's called darshan, which is where you go see her, and it's all in silence. You just go kneel before her and then look into her eyes and then sit back down. And it's like, 3 hours of otherwise silent meditation while everybody else goes and gets their darshan.
Yeah.
I knew I had to go see her. I didn't know what this connection was. I spent hours looking in her eyes and wondering, is this made up in my mind, or are you really hearing me the way I feel like you're hearing me? And I remember when I finally did have Mother Meera's darshan, it was such a powerful silence in there. My mind was so quiet, and I looked in Mother's eyes, and the only thought that came across my mind was, "Oh." It was this realization, like, you are real, and this wasn't in my mind. And that light that I connected with became a guiding force. Really, what brought me to DC. When I was at Yogaville, I had been hearing a lot about a famous Indian saint named Amachi. Full name is Mata Amritanandamai, but she's called the Hugging Saint. And people asked me at Yogaville, who's your guru? I was like, I was very anti-guru back then still, like most Westerners are, right? Yeah. And I said, well, she says she's not a guru, but if I had to say anybody, it'd be Mother Meera. And they say, oh, is that woman who's hugging people? And I was like, no. And then I found out about Amachi, who has hugged tens of millions of people. Wow. And when I went to go see her, it was a very similar experience of like, oh my God, I'm looking at a living miracle. Because it was like, Amma's hugging people for hours and hours and hours on end. And you just sit there and watch her like, oh, she must really know that person and really love them. Something special going on. Oh, she must really love that person and know that, something special going on.
500
Every
later.
single person, right?
Right.
And you see her not stopping for hours upon hour, never taking a break until everybody's hugged. And then it was a living miracle that I saw. And Amachi's program was up in the DC area. And so that was how I met somebody who introduced me to the activist house that I moved into. And I've been trying to leave DC ever since. Right? But
So when you think about your relationship with this region, obviously you have a family, and that ties you into a place a little more deeply. And I've shared this with you. I have entertained moving elsewhere. And a part of that is driven by the fact that DC for me represents a big office. It's a big office space. And there's a constant emotional drain. Even sitting here in this studio recording, the buzz and the whirs and the beeps of everything around you, it's almost like this electrical pulse that seems to just innately exist within my brain. And there's this deep, deep longing for me to be a little closer to nature and be in the mountains, be in the forest, just connect in some way, shape, or form. What's your relationship been with that? Because DC is, in many ways, it's a concrete jungle. It's not nearly as big as something like New York or maybe even Toronto, but it
is a swampland, right?
Yeah. And it can be hard to get away.
Yeah.
It's just that requires in and of itself an immense amount of energy to really separate from the city.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. My first 4 years living here, so I didn't have a car. Then a yoga student generously gave me a car.
Very beautiful.
And,
That's great. That's a great gift.
And I remember the first time I was driving out of the city after being here for so long, just taking the metro or whatever, and I was like, oh my God, this is what oxygen is like again. You don't realize the stagnation here also, like the air quality is really not good. But yeah, and so that does grind on you. And so like I just mentioned, like I've been trying to leave it ever since, like it's funny when I go back sometimes through old emails, I'm like, oh wow, there I was talking to somebody else about how I'm getting ready to leave DC, and I'm still here 20 years later.
Right.
Because there's a mission of purpose that you find here that holds your feet here, opportunities like this,
Yeah, this is wonderful.
Yeah. And that's really rewarding in its own right. You find rivers of light, in the city of darkness. This is, many ways like the heart of darkness of the world, because America is the most powerful country in the world, and DC is its power center. Yeah. So I've been really fortunate to see so many incredible things here and to meet incredible people.
I think throughout this journey, you've experienced a variety of evolutions within yourself, and now you're starting to embark on one that's more in line with yoga therapy. I think you mentioned in the early 2000s, there was sort of the yoga craze, and then there was a little bit of like a capitalist twist that seemed to overtake that for the fitness industry purposes, but now yoga therapy is something that you're pursuing more fully. And what does that look like for you now?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier how I was sort of excommunicated from the yoga fitness world, and that was such a blessing, really, because I was able to find my niche. Because why is it I'm so passionate about the original yoga? Well, one, it offers us a science of consciousness that I think if we study it, and if we have the philosophical wherewithal to recognize that it is a science, we can actually see that it is even a superior science to Western science. The origins of our science are based on this idea that nature can be understood with our five senses alone. And contrasted to all the ancient schools, they were called schools of mysteries, right? Because they're esoteric. You had to be initiated in them in order to learn. And what did that initiation entail? It wasn't just book learning. It wasn't just, I can do these equations, I can list off these facts. It was a transformation of yourself. It was a transformation of your experience of reality. Yeah. There is, some speculation that entheogens were used in these, even with Gnostic Christianity. There's a lot of signs that psilocybin mushrooms that were very much part of ancient Gnostic.
And there's a fabulous documentary on Netflix called Fantastic Fungi.
I've seen it. It's amazing.
Just mind-blowing. The time lapses in that are just insane.
Exactly.
But it alludes to a lot of what you're talking about here, as well as this opening of early humans' minds. Yeah.
And so it's been frustrating for me to see, especially how the West, even people are interested in yoga therapy, how they're digesting yoga. They're still looking at it from the point of this inferior science, of thinking this is all biomechanical, it's chemical, there's neural pathways. And I'm not discounting the value of that, right? Because 95% of the healing is the belief that you've been healed, right? And if I showed somebody a yoga pose and it healed them, they wouldn't believe it unless there's some kind of like literature explaining some kind of pathway that, that could
now it's real.
Right. Now it's real.
Right.
But the reason why yoga is a superior science is because it includes the experience of consciousness that you can access in yourself. This is why there's so many millions of renunciates in India, and there have been since prehistoric times, is because they're not delusional. You know, it's incredible arrogance to think that they're just off in la la land. You know, they're tapping something real, and what they're tapping is this incredible wealth of truth that can serve us to understand our own spiritual journey. And this is why this is so important, because healing is connected to our own spiritual journey. If you're getting sick, it's for a reason. You know, if anything happens, actually, it's for a reason. But to start to really view your life like that takes a certain amount of courage and a lot of self-reflection. But this is why disease happens a lot of times, is sort of to push us into questioning things a little bit deeper and to evolve. If you understand that yoga is a superior science in that way, it has the incredible miraculous healing power to offer us that can't be explained but through physical phenomena. The original practice of yoga asana is a form of prayer. And prayer, you know, we usually think of prayer as words, like you're talking to the divine, you're talking to some unseen higher force, or you're thinking thoughts, you know, usually in desperation. But the beauty of the asana is that it's a posture that itself is a prayer. It's body language, and you're holding yourself in that prayer. It has a profound effect on the nervous system. It transforms you into an aspect of nature, really. And this is what we're all seeking, is that reconnection. Nature is interconnected. Everything's interconnected. And so yoga therapy has been a place where I've naturally found myself, because people who are seeking healing, I noticed this early on, actually, when I started, because I was always teaching classes on donation basis. It was very important to me that there wasn't a price tag barrier for people. And I would do certain programs at schools, you know, for disenfranchised youth. And whenever I would teach underprivileged populations, I was amazed at how they connected to it immediately. You know, like leaps that took me years to make, they were making instantly, because they may have been suffered a lot of lack of privilege in their lives, but that gave them a spiritual wealth that allowed them to recognize the gems that were there.
So do you think that they were more receptive and more open to experiencing change in their own lives, and that was sort of the catalyst for them being able to go into that environment with you and just be ready?
Yeah, exactly. And contrasted to, you know, the studios are more, in general, more a privileged class society. It's not a cheap thing to take a yoga class. And
if you look at the higher end spots, there's a pretty good price tag attached to some of those.
Is that right? Classes. I haven't kept up with it for a while. So and those kind of populations are really hard to reach, right? Because they have the spiritual poverty of privilege, and they're looking, when you have a lot of privilege, your outlook is, how can this serve me? You know, well, how can I use this for my own desires? Right.
Like a tool almost.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why yoga's been commodified, because people are wanting to use it as a commodity. But I don't think it was an accident, you know, because yoga would not have been released from India unless, you know, this was intended. Because I really believe that the yoga masters are such incredible beings that they have that power, you know. So what's happening now is this, I feel like a new renaissance. Been really inspired by cinema recently, whereas before I would watch movies and just feel depressed about humanity and where society's head is at, you know. And now, like, I just saw like the new Black Panther movie, and I was like, wow, this was...
I want to watch it so badly.
I've
heard
so
great
good.
things.
I mean, it's funny because they touch on really deep spiritual topics there, and part of me inside was cringing a little bit. I was imagining if I was like, you know, indigenous person in Africa, seeing some of these sacred practices being used in a Marvel universe, you know?
Right.
But then I think about how many African Americans there are in this country who they're watching this and they feel for the first time in their life some sense of pride about their identity, and it was really beautiful. And I really feel like this renaissance is happening. This new level of looking deeper at these questions. I think the possibility of people recognizing that this universe we live in is consciousness, and how empowering that is,
Right.
and how yoga can help empower you to make the most of your life and to find your own path.
Yeah.
Right? This is the real beauty of it. And that's because that's the thing. The sacred heals.
Yes.
Right. It heals everything.
Yeah.
And that's why we turn to it.
Yeah. Well, the fact that these things are now making their way into more mainstream media, we talk about, one of the biggest blockbusters of the year, in Black Panther, that, I think you mentioned, you look at that and you say, I hope this is not disenfranchising any groups or not appropriately representing something that was historically or culturally important to them.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's also putting this out there in front of so many more eyes, and in many ways is hopefully a catalyst for that revolution that you speak about, where people are now more receptive, more open to these changes. And I just have to say that I hope that is the case too, because for such a long time in my life, there was a rejection of a higher power, or a rejection of what a lot of people would call traditional religion. But at the same time, I know deep within myself that there is this intense longing for more spiritual connection and to feel a little bit more connected. And I don't know if that's just because of where I am in my life right now, but I think in many ways it's because I long for something deeper. I look at what I do on a day-to-day basis, creating imagery through photo and video, and I ask myself, much like you have asked yourself throughout your life, is this it? Is this what my life is?
Mm-hmm.
And I hope there's more.
Right.
I want to be open to that, and I hope that this message also communicates that to others who feel the same way. That if you're open to it and you want to move toward it, that there are options for you. So.
Yeah, and it's really important to know if you're in that seat of feeling this desire to want to connect, that you only need that desire, right? As long as you focus on that desire, the connections will come.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned before, these schools of mysticism and real yoga is an esoteric practice. This means it's hidden. You have to be brought in. But they say when the student is ready, the guru comes, right? And that's the guru is praised as beyond space and time, and so you don't need a living master even. Any enlightened master that you feel connected to, they're your guru, right? And cultivate that relationship, and you'll start noticing your guru talking to you through the universe.
Right. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, when you think about what is next for you, I know you talked about a book that you're working on, which has a phenomenal and very catchy title. But how are you taking those next steps and looking forward? I
struggle with this, with the voice there, because there's so much to convey, as you very rightfully said. And I have trouble remembering that, this is a massive journey that I undertook, and with immense blessings behind it, to be able to get to the point of understanding and knowledge that I am at right now. And I'm not thinking of myself in a big way, but I just know that the understanding that I have and what I appreciate about yoga is a very difficult thing to convey.
Yes.
And so, you're right. The title is very catchy. It's called Yoga is Like Sex.
Yeah.
The subtitle is Healing the Fear of the Sacred. And because there is that aspect, I feel like not everybody's going to understand how yoga's being commodified, right? But everybody will be able to easily and readily see how sex has been commodified.
Everywhere, every day, every second.
Yeah, and as we touched on earlier, the sexual abuse in our country is massive, and so this is an incredible pain point for our country and for our culture. When I grew up in the 80s, you just saw media treating sex as a commodity and entertainment and just very irreverent references all the time, right?
Yeah. When you look back at older night show interviews and things like that, there's obviously still a lot of sexism in our society today and in our media, but there are some extremely blatant examples, late 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where you watch it back and you're like, they said that on air. Right. Wow. Just incredible. It is bad, but it's out there. So.
Yeah. And I think that demon has really showed its ugly head in the past few years. One of the blessings of the pandemic, Corona means like a halo, right? It was like a magnifying glass that highlighted everything that we had going on around us and made it blatant, shamelessly in our face. And especially the sexism piece. The leader of the free world was unabashed sexist, said terrible things about women and faced no consequences, right? And
fascinating, honestly.
Yeah. But this has absolutely created this awareness of the toxic masculinity that we have, and I do have hope that the feminine force is rising. I felt it when I was watching Black Panther. Actually, it was very clear. The feminine force is one that really just cares that people are fed and clothed and taken care of. Right. Men love to fight ego wars, and women are always left cleaning up the aftermath. Right. So if the feminine force really rises in our society, if more people connect with the power of Divine Mother, I really think we can have a beautiful world.
Well, a lot of people will hear a word like toxic masculinity, and we live in a society right now that is extremely polarized. So you have people who have a completely negative reaction to a phrase or a word like that, and others who will identify the deeper meaning and understand that there's not ill intent behind it. It's a message of love and connectedness that this Divine Mother is intended to help us rise as a whole. It's not to ostracize one group or another. It's to care and love for all of us. So when you have a message like that, how do you convey it to everyone where, it's not your responsibility for them to receive it in any kind of way, but to bring us all together as a whole when you're communicating that message? How do you do that when you think about spreading that message in a way that more people are receptive to?
It's interesting because this demon of patriarchy that has been plaguing our world is very dark. And you're right that it goes unrecognized, right? Because it wants to hide in the darkness. If you're a man benefiting from the privilege of being a man, then you're naturally going to have a reaction to something like toxic masculinity, right? But and this is, what the blessing of the murder of George Floyd gave society. I think it was a global recognition, of how our privilege is influencing our realities. And so, the demon of toxic masculinity is really disgusting and scary. It's one that is incredibly derogatory towards women. Thinks of women as stupid. Thinks of them as just physical objects, totally, worthless. And for somebody like me and you who love our mothers so much, like, it's hiding. It's hiding in our society. I remember walking home one time with a friend of a friend who I thought was a really good guy, and he was drunk and started talking about how stupid women were, and I had to hold back, hold back my fists,
Yeah, what the hell?
But it was like, wow, where did that come from? We don't know how big this is, but if we can recognize and help us appreciate the sort of struggle that we're facing here. But that's just it, is that the force of Divine Mother is about love, and that's the truth of God that was taken from us. What has caused this religious trauma is the idea that God is for you under these conditions, right? And God is not actually yours. God is mine, and I'm giving you God under these conditions, right?
Yeah, you have to play by the rules that we're outlining for you.
Exactly, yeah. And the truth that cannot be denied is that God is for everyone. God is not owned by anyone. God doesn't hold back, just like the sun doesn't choose who to shine on, right?
Exactly.
And that is something that you can see in the force of Divine Mother so easily and so beautifully, because Mother's love is just for all the children, obviously.
Yeah.
And Mother will lead you to the Father. In my own journey, I was raised as kind of Christian,
Well, you talk early on about being in Virginia Beach, at least you had the military base very close by, and then you had the Christian Broadcast Network, CBN, right, just a couple miles down the road.
That's
so that's
right.
fascinating that you, at the very beginning of your journey, you had that cluster of entities so close to one another.
Exactly, yeah. And it's funny because I mentioned earlier how my mother loves everybody, but the one group that she has the hardest time loving, she still manages to love them. But the one group she always has the hardest time with is born again Christians, and I myself suffered from a reactionary, feeling towards the sacred name of Jesus Christ for so long. And it was Divine Mother who led me to an authentic connection with Christ. And when you have that authentic, direct connection, then the pain goes away.
Yeah.
Right. Then the stigma goes away, and then the forgiveness comes for everybody who's abusing that sacred name.
Yeah.
Right. And that's real freedom. That's actual, real freedom to be able to forgive. There's a beautiful story of Genghis Khan. He was one of these tyrants, like his toxic masculine tyrants. His food was this feeling that he was great, and he wanted everybody to be terrified of him.
Right.
And this crazy how many women he impregnated, like the people.
There's some statistic about the number of genetic offspring that still exist in the gene pool as a direct result of his sexual conquests.
Exactly. And there's this great story of how he went into this one town and was killing and pillaging and looting, and he saw this yogi sitting underneath the tree, and while all this violence was going around, the yogi was sitting there with this beautiful, peaceful smile. Right? And that really pissed off Genghis Khan. And so
I'm getting this visual in my head. Just like...
And so he jumps off his horse, runs up to the yogi, grabs his sword, points it right at his heart. And he says to him, "Don't you know I could run the sword through your heart without blinking an eye?" Mm-hmm. And the yogi, still in his perfect bliss, says, "Don't you know you could run that sword through my heart without me blinking an eye?"
Yeah, and right back at you.
Right. And so that's the demonstration, like what is real power?
Yeah.
One of the signs of Kali Yuga, which is the age of darkness that Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma talks about, is that money will be the sole measure for people's worth. And I see that very much. I've seen that very much in the yoga world. There'd be some incredible saint yoga master coming through town, and people would choose to go to the famous yoga teacher who's making a lot of money, right? Because that's what they identify as success, right? But real success isn't money, because in the end, if you don't have anybody that you love around you, what does your life mean? It doesn't matter how much money you have.
What is it worth?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions that I've always tried to ask people, and I'm developing this palette and refining it as I meet more and more people and have them on the podcast, but it's looking at yourself in the mirror now and really reflecting on who you are. Who do you see when you see yourself looking back?
See somebody who's still struggling to get through life.
Yeah.
No, one of the greatest blessings in my life is becoming a father. And a daughter, no less, as a devotee of Divine Mother, get to see Divine Mother in her infancy. Mm-hmm. It's the sweetest experience, but parenthood, I remember my friend telling me when I became a dad, he was like, "Oh, I'm going to talk to you differently now, you're part of the insiders club," right?
Right.
And it's true. It's one of those adventures that, unless you're in it, you can't possibly imagine, but it's so rich. So that's a huge part of my identity now, that I love being a dad. And I'm finding more avenues for talking about yoga in its original form, in particularly as in the world of yoga therapy. Because as I mentioned earlier, yoga may have been co-opted into this fitness thing, and it still has its benefits. I'm not decrying it, absolutely not. Like I think I mentioned before, this happened for a reason, and it's a very good thing because a lot of people are finding refuge in those communities.
Yes.
But if people want to take their individual study deeper, that's where I really see myself as a conduit, helping people to make those connections, helping people to find their own path.
Right.
And I'm so happy that the different yoga teacher trainings I've had, like the students went on to find their own connections, and to develop and cultivate that on their own. It feels like the most gratifying thing in the world, Yeah. So I'm also really busy now as a yoga therapist. Interestingly enough, the majority of my yoga therapy clients are Indian, right? But it gives me a great opportunity to see the powers of yoga therapy at play, because Indians in general, it's a very disciplined culture, can't generalize in general about anything, right? But yeah, most Indians, there's a discipline value in that culture. And especially they've been raised with understanding who a yogi really is. No Indian grows up in their village or their town without hearing some miracle from the local sadhu. They know that yoga is all powerful, and so they really come with this faith, and they'll bring every kind of health problem you can imagine, to be healed by yoga therapy. And so, I prescribe asanas, I work with them in different ways. But it's wonderful to see that evolution and the work happening. And it gives me a lot of confidence that more people will be open to receiving it. It's given me a platform also to talk about what yoga really is, because once you change the practice, it loses that supernatural healing power. It still has healing power, I'm not denying it, but it's not much different than the healing power from exercise.
Right.
Exercise is wonderful. It's going to give you a long life, but yoga can give you so much more.
Yeah. As a final note on the wealth of self, and again, I have to say thank you so much, because it's just a title, right, at the end of the day. But it again has always been a conduit for me to hear people's stories. And in many ways, it's been an opportunity for me to develop myself too, because I realize there are things about my life and my path that I want more clarity on. And hearing and observing others is one of the greatest tools that I've been able to utilize for my own learning. And I hope that will be the case for anyone listening or watching this as well, that they can hear your voice and hear your experiences and understand that, not to model necessarily, but to observe and absorb. They can take some of those messages home with themselves and maybe change their life or the lives of those around them. So when it comes to your definition of wealth, what has that meant to you? I know some people attach a monetary figure to that, but I think when all is said and done, at the end of the day, very few people are worried about their account. It's generally something much deeper than that.
Yeah. There's a lot of conversion that happens on the deathbed, right? My definition of wealth, I would say, is connection, which is really what yoga means in its root level. The root of yoga comes from the word yuj, which means to yoke, to unite, to connect. And these connections that I've been so incredibly blessed with, it gives me the greatest joy to share them, And so if somebody else is looking for connection, I absolutely hope they feel comfortable reaching out to me, because I always love to hear from people who are thirsty for more. And I never pretend to be a guru, so please don't think of me as a guru. But I can definitely help with those connections, and it's been a real honor for me. Sometimes, people get referred to me for various reasons, and to help make those connections is such a satisfying feeling. This is something also so beautiful about Sanatana Dharma, is wealth is Divine Mother, right? She's Lakshmi Devi, and there's 8 forms of wealth. But the wealth of knowledge is a very special wealth, because it's the only wealth that you get richer by giving it away. So I'm so grateful for this opportunity to be able to share this wealth.
Thank you.
And I hope other people can receive it and share it also.
Absolutely. And I just want to reiterate one point that you made, but in any and all interactions that I've ever had with you. You are extraordinarily peaceful and very approachable. And so for folks who are out there who want to engage with you, I think that barrier is non-existent for the most part. It's really up to them to make that push forward and come out and meet you. But again, thank you. You've been an inspiring figure in my life, and I hope that our connection remains strong and we can continue to do more work together. Telling your story in a short film sort of aspect is something that I would really be honored to do. And I think we've spoken about that very briefly. But again, the story that you have is so intricate and so deep. In many ways, I feel like it's hard for me to do it justice with my interview. But I do hope that it scratches the surface for some people out there and serves as maybe a foundation of inspiration for them to take a leap in their life and explore their spirituality more deeply. Yeah,
and thank you, because I just mentioned about how the greatest wealth is connection. I really feel like this connection that we've made is such an inspiring wealth for me also, because I have struggled to find platforms where I can share. It's not like I want to go out and preach on the street corner, right? And it's very much the kind of thing that I'm only going to share if I'm invited to. And you've been so amazing. Like, I'm just so impressed with your passion for what you're doing here. It's really inspiring and beautiful.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and it's a long road ahead. I know there are more techniques and skills to develop, but I'm hoping to make it my own as I go through that journey. And I just appreciate you coming in tonight. So
I'm still very much a student too.
Thank you, Darin.
Thank you, Jason.
Absolutely. Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in on this episode of The Wealth of Self. As always, your viewership is immensely appreciated. If you want to take it a step further, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you are among the first people to know when new content is released onto our channel. Additionally, this is all about hearing voices. If you have any questions, anything that really resonated with you during this episode, leave a comment down below. I'm very eager to hear your voices and your thoughts. Until next time, thanks for watching The Wealth of Self.